Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, my guest is Kristi Martin, a highly respected policy strategist and implementer whose career has expanded patient advocacy, CMS leadership, as well as strategic consulting with the Camber Collective. Kristi is known for bridging the gap between policy development and real-world operations, ensuring that big ideas can actually work in practice. Today, we're going to explore the landscape of the U.S. drug pricing policy, real-world evidence, and market access, and how policies like the IRA and the ACA continue to reshape what access and affordability mean in real life. Welcome, Kristi.
Thank you, Patti. I really appreciate the invite to be here today.
So why don't we get started? And we're going to start with your origin story. I have heard you talk a little bit about that your path into health policy started a little bit by accident from a family event. You grew up in rural Kentucky, and you lost your father to cancer. And through that, you realized that the clinical trial drug that didn't work for him later became the standard of care. How did that personal experience shape your understanding of time, timing, evidence, and access in policy decisions?
So, Patti, after that experience, I knew I wanted to be in healthcare, but not a doctor or a nurse or any type of provider. But I didn't know quite what that meant. And so when I went to school, I ended up majoring in health communication, and that led me to the National Cancer Institute, where I was doing research in social science. And after that experience, I ended up kind of falling into health policy because social science research and health policy analysis are not that far apart in terms of skill set. And it almost lent itself to being in the right time at the right place. I kind of came into DC at a time when Massachusetts was starting to take on Romney Care. California and Governor Schwarzenegger were also dealing with high rates of uninsurance, people without health care, people that were paying high prices for their health care. And so started working on private health insurance reform at the state level. And then ultimately, what became the Affordable Care Act. So really fortunate kind of being in the right place at the right time, right skill set, right people. And, just really thankful that I was, because I got to be a part of some really big health policy wins, and got an opportunity to not only be part of the policy, but also operationalize the policy.
So you really have been at the heart of some of our most significant health policy implemented programs. And you've worked across patient advocacy with the ACA, the IRA, drug pricing reform. What is constant across all of those chapters?
I think one thing that's really constant is, when you're thinking about policy, you're thinking about operationalizing policy, one thing that I like to focus on is policy only matters in the last mile. So, and what I mean by that is you can have the best idea. You can have the most perfect policy. But if it doesn't work for the patient at the end of the policy, the person who the policy is meant for, because it can't be operationalized or because it doesn't flow through the system as intended, because the system that we're dealing with is a Rube Goldberg machine at best, then the policy doesn't work. It's not that great. And so that's been the constant theme, throughout my career, is trying to find what is the policy that is going to work until the last mile. It's really going to deliver for people. And I think, thinking about who is the policy being built for. There's a lot of different stakeholders in healthcare, and at the end of the day, your ultimate stakeholder is really going to be consumers and patients. But there's also people that are part of the supply chain. There's providers, there's pharmacists, there's wholesalers, there's scientists. There's a lot of people that are in there that you also have to think through. So for me, that's always been the constant, is how do you think about all the people that are there and how will they be impacted?
Can you give us an example when good policy failed at that last mile? And how do
Yeah.
you do that today?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest one is 2013 when healthcare.gov launched. I was in the federal government when that happened. And I think everybody knows that that wasn't the brightest moment of the Affordable Care Act. That wasn't the best, the best experience. I think everybody, felt that that was when we didn't quite make it, and we failed at the last mile. And we were able to turn it around eventually. And we were able to make healthcare.gov work and people had a better experience. But that's a great example of we just didn't get there. We didn't make it what we wanted it to be. And I think conceptually, we were all working toward what we thought it could be, but we couldn't make the policies that we had envisioned flow through to the operation.
So then 10 years later, you're in the heat of the IRA. What lessons from the ACA did you personally and your team apply to the IRA?
Well, and I think that's a good example. With the healthcare.gov situation, there were so many pieces of that we learned from that experience that we brought into the Inflation Reduction Act implementation. Time was one of the challenges in implementation. Resources was another challenge. And so learning from the Affordable Care Act implementation, we knew that we had to think about how do we staff up appropriately? How do we resource appropriately? How do we think about operations along with operations? One of our very senior staff people said, policy without operations is just academia. And so when you're thinking about the policy, you have to think about the operations at the same time as what she meant. And so as we're starting to build the policy, bringing our operations people into the room with us so that at the same time we're doing those policy debates, they're talking to us about, well, that's not possible operationally. You can't do that. Or that policy option will take longer to build than this policy option. So we would have a realistic idea of what's feasible and on what timeline it's feasible. The negotiation program, in particular, Medicare drug price negotiation program, within 12 months, we had to select the drugs. That's very fast for the government. And even all the Medicare provisions that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, our first implementation happened. The law passed in August of 2022. Our actual first implementation was October of 2022. And then the next one was January of 2023. And then one in April of 2023. We had implementation milestones to hit in almost every quarter. And so kind of knowing how to do that and how to make sure we were, building the plane and doing it at the same time we were able to hit the milestones and do the policy work all at the same time. A lot of those lessons were coming out of our Affordable Care Act experience.
If you were to design a US HTA with all of these lessons learned and with the groups that are attempting to do this in the non-governmental arenas, what would you build differently to make it work in practice?
Oh, Patty, that's such a good question. And I hope we get there one day. I think that, you look at the different types of entities that have been set up over time, different types of advisory committees that have been set up. You can think about MedPAC, which is the Medicare Payment Advisory Committee. Medicaid also has one. You can think about PCORI. You can think about the Agency for Healthcare and Research and Quality. They have the evidence-based practice centers. I would take a look at all those different things, right? They all have kind of components that lend themselves to an HTA. And there's pieces of them that work very well. And start to pick apart, what are the pieces that work really well? And you think about how do you bring in the right subject matter expertise? How do you bring in the right funding mechanisms? How do you bring through the right types of cadences of work? How do you build in the right inputs into agencies? And I do think ARC, and there's grant process for the evidence-based practice centers is a really good model to think about. And then think about how do you create the independence like MedPAC. MedPAC has a lot of independence. And one reason it has that is because it reports to Congress. It doesn't report to an agency. And so trying to think about those kind of components of how you build it and who does it report to and how do you make sure that it has independence. One thing to kind of also think about is what authority do you want it to have? Do you want it to have binding authority over Medicare or Medicaid? Or do you want it to have more of, it's going to put information out there as advisory, and then payers can choose to say, yes, I want to use that information, or they can choose not to use it. And I think it's easier to say that information is out there and they can choose to use it or not use it. And I think you also have models like, the Veterans Administration, they use ICER reports. So it's really looking at kind of these different landscapes and putting together the right pieces and the pieces that have been very effective. And sometimes it's kind of the pieces that you may not think about.
So you mentioned ICER reports, and I know that you engage occasionally with the ICER organization. Can you comment on that process that they are using, and what takeaways do you have from that, and that would improve its usefulness across the board with payers?
Yeah, I think the thing about ICER is, they kind of came up out of the ACA a little bit, because PCORI wasn't able to do the kind of cost work I think that ICER is doing. It gave ICER a space to play and fill a gap that PCORI wasn't able to do. And I really admire all the work that they're doing. One thing that I think that ICER really needs is, they're just limited on what they can do because of resources. I think that they have a great relationship with the Veterans Administration. I think with the negotiation, they've been able to submit some reports on some of the drugs that have been selected for negotiation. But they can't do them all. Part of it's because of the timing. The drugs get selected and basically the reports have to be in within, 30 days. And so it's a very tight turnaround. And so if they haven't already done the reports, it's really hard to be able to produce them in such a short turnaround. But I think, what it would be really interesting to see what they could do as more and more Medicaid programs are moving to, kind of unique models where they're trying to figure out how do they either negotiate themselves on supplemental rebates, how states are working with the prescription and drug affordability boards. We're all kind of moving in a similar directions, but we're missing kind of the same type of evidence, right? And there's organizations like ICER, there's others out there that are doing, related type of work. But how can we more effectively and efficiently resource this information? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's what we're missing right now. We're not being really efficient with our resources to the entities that are doing this type of work. So I hope we get there one day where we're able to have bodies that can do this type of work and all payers will have access to them and be able to use them versus it being so piecemealed the way it is right now. And hoping that, the charity of organizations like ICER take it on because either they've been commissioned by somebody or because they decide to do it because they've gotten a grant or because they've been working with a payer or another consortium to do it. But, I think that they're doing great work and I hope they can keep it up. And obviously resources is one of the issues.
So you alluded to our occasional relationship with evidence when it should be a common relationship with evidence. And there's a recurring cycle in health policy that we keep having the same debates about evidence and pricing. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the U.S. struggles so much to integrate evidence generation into pricing and access frameworks?
I think the U.S. health system is such a unique health system. And as I mentioned before, it's kind of a Rube Goldberg machine. It's been built over time and, it's grown over time and driven by maybe the wrong incentives. And that's one reason. I think we're seeing an issue right now where affordability is just kind of cropping up everywhere. I mean, we're talking about drugs and devices and things like that, but I mean, you're seeing it across the board in hospitals and all spaces, really, in healthcare. And I think the issue with evidence is there's gatekeepers. There's people who have the data, who own the data. And if the data doesn't help them, they're not going to release it. I anticipate there's a lot of data that's available. It's a lot of data and evidence that has already been done that is just not, publicly available. And so, I think we live in a world where, there's gatekeepers on information. And so unless that information is publicly available, or unless somebody mandates it to be released or made publicly available, it only gets released if it, improves the bottom line, unfortunately. And so I hope one day we get to a point where, we have more post-market data, we have more evidence generation, we have more real-world evidence out there, we have more transparency around evidence, but we're just not quite there yet.
If you were in charge and you could build in an incentive structure that would incentivize pharma to release some of these data, what would that look like, and how would that be crafted?
I think that's a great question. I think we were trying to do that with part of the negotiation program. I think by incorporating some of the therapeutic alternative comparative effectiveness into the negotiation process as part of the negotiation, we are pushing the companies a little bit. And, I anticipate they might be doing this for the second round as they're completing that second round right now, pushing some of the companies to start looking at, maybe you should be doing head-to-head trials. Maybe you should be looking at post-market real-world evidence against your therapeutic alternatives, and doing some of these comparisons and maybe releasing some of that information, putting out the public explanations after the negotiations are done. So I think, in little ways, we were hoping to kind of push to do that, working with FDA because they also had an interest in real-world data and real-world evidence getting out there and incentivizing it. So, I think there's little things that we can do ultimately, and I think it's around, payers like Medicare and incentivizing and encouraging it, and continuing. I think state Medicaid programs could also play a role in that. I also think that FDA could also play a role in that. We saw some over the last few years, definitely under Commissioner Gottlieb, and then that continued under Commissioner Califf, but looking at the companies that had used the accelerated approval program and really cracking down on those that had not completed their post-marketing clinical trials and saying, if you didn't complete those, we're going to take a real hard look about whether you should be on the market or not. Mm-hmm. And you saw companies starting to complete those and making sure they were filing them in clinicaltrials.gov. So, I think that there's things that we can do. I think that is a big question. And I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because it has to be the right type of incentive, because you don't want to tilt too far and maybe, be too costly to do, too hard to do. You have to think about what's enough that they're willing to do it without maybe sacrificing something that would be like, oh no, that's a bridge too far. So I think it's what's the right balance, and how do you think about it, and how does it actually feed into the pricing incentives because ultimately we're trying to figure out, right, how do you get to a price that's fair, that makes a drug available, that helps to give patients and providers enough information that they can make a clinical decision based on what's right for the patient situation. But, patient situations can change. Each patient might have a different clinical choice that they want to make for themselves. Mm-hmm. So you have to balance all those things.
So you've mentioned that FDA and CMS have fundamentally different missions. The FDA being focused on safety and efficacy, and CMS focused on coverage and payment. What is the most promising way to better align those two agencies around patient-centered access? And in fact, what role can industry play in bridging that gap responsibly? That would be something you think they would actually do.
Yeah. And I think about it, Patty, as, they both care so much about patients. My time working with FDA when I was at CMS and then also working with FDA when I was in the secretary's office, I just admire the FDA staff so much because they care so deeply about their jobs and about their mission and what they do. And the thing that I see where there's commonality, and there is a lot of commonality and between the two agencies, that there are things like real world evidence where they both have interest, where they both have things that they agree that they both are, want to work toward. And I think that where there's parts where they can be maybe more aligned or more together is doing things like we were doing this when I was at CMS, but leadership and staff talking frequently, talking about what their goals are, talking about what their priorities are, working together when they're thinking through policy and thinking through what they want to do. I think it's also like with industry, whenever I talk to folks, and I think this works for the patient advocacy groups as well, when industry is talking to both agencies, letting the staff at those agencies know who they're talking to. Because sometimes in CMS, like they'll say they're talking to FDA, but we don't know who in FDA. And same thing for CMS. When you're thinking about an agency that has thousands of people, saying you're talking to FDA, it's really hard to know who that might be because there's so many people. So making sure that there's transparency of who are you talking to? Because you never know when it might be helpful to be like, if you say a name, then the staff at CMS can be like, oh, well, I can just call them up and we can just talk directly. And that could make it easier. I was on a panel yesterday with some folks at CEDAR at FDA, and we were talking about BLA applications for biosimilars and how some of them get split. Same company, same biosimilar, and they split their BLA applications up. And how that would be helpful if the CMS staff could talk to the FDA staff, thinking about, whenever a manufacturer comes in for billing codes and they're applying for their BLA, and the industry, the company can say, well, I'm talking this person at CMS, FDA, and at FDA, they can say, well, I'm talking this person at FDA, they can say who they're talking to. And then that may help so that the FDA and the CMS people can confer and maybe figure out okay, how do we align the BLA application and the coding applications, so that we know the timing, we understand what's connected, because the billing applications are on a quarterly cycle, and the BLA applications might be on a different cycle. Mm-hmm. So there could be ways to help coordinate so that at the end of the day, the company actually gets maybe a more efficient process out of it all between the two agencies.
So let's break this down into a simple 1, 2, 3 suggestion. What 3 recommendations do you have for pharma or biotech firms when they are trying to engage both regulators and payers? What should they do differently or better?
I'd say 1, keep the dialogue open. I think a lot of times people think, oh, I don't need to come in and talk to them. Go in and talk to agencies. CMS staff love that, and they appreciate it when people come to talk to them. 2, stay on top of changes happening. There's a lot of FAQs, proposed rules that come out. Make sure you understand kind of what the shifting policy is underneath and know what your questions are before you go in and talk. And then I think 3, getting in early and having conversations versus getting in when you have a problem. It's easier to maybe proactively address some issues or questions than it is to resolve a problem once it's happened. So I think those would be my 3 key points or key pieces of advice for a company or whether it's pharma or medtech.
So the top of that list was talking, keep talking, and you've alluded to that in some of the earlier responses as well. If you could institute a structured communication process, an ICER-like or some other style that convened between CMS, for example, and industry, what would that look like on a structured communication process?
Yeah, there is one for devices that was stood up. It's been a little clunky. So it's called the parallel review process, and it's for medical devices. It's limited on the number that it can handle each year. And so it's a process where FDA and CMS communicate with the medical device company on a parallel process. And so they basically convene on a parallel process as they go through the approval process and the coverage and billing code process. I think something like that. But, as I mentioned before, some of this comes down to resources. Do they have the budget? Do they have the staffing? Do they have the operational builds to be able to do this? But having those type of built-in structures so they can have parallel processing so that they can make sure that they're making those connections, that's the important part. And I think that those are things. And then they also, CMS over time has built through 21st Century Cures Act. They have an ombudsman for pharmaceutical and device companies to come in, especially if they're pre-revenue or if they're newer companies, to come in and walk them through coding, pricing, coverage, so that CMS staff can actually walk them through before they start to even go through that process with CMS, walk them through what it could look like and, make sure that they understand what they're getting into. And that can be useful before they even maybe get to FDA. So they can work with them before they go over to FDA. And so there's processes like that are already there. But the parallel process is a good one to look at and kind of learn from. I think there's improvements that could be made there, but it's one model that exists that could be expanded upon.
You have talked about CMS building a transaction facilitator based on feedback from the supply chain and all the stakeholders. What's an example of when a stakeholder listened directly during this dialogue and it actually changed their implementation success?
So there's been a number in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that one of the examples that we have, I think we commonly point to, is during the process of working through all the guidances we had to do to set up the negotiation program, the patient advocacy organizations came to us, in particular, some of the rare disease organizations, and said, you need a patient engagement process to give patient input into the negotiation process. And so as a result of that, we talked through it before we put out our guidance, and then we put out our guidance. And we heard more from them after we put out our guidance the first time around, and then talked to them some more. And as part of that kind of open dialogue, we ended up doing the patient listening sessions, was one thing we did. The second thing we did is that we also opened up the data submission for the data that goes into for the therapeutic alternatives and comparative effectiveness and the impacts on special populations and unmet medical need, all that data, we opened it to the public so the public could submit that data. And those were two changes we made just based on that feedback we were receiving from patient advocacy groups. And we agreed with them. We thought that was a good idea. We felt like that was missing from what the law had, laid out in the statute. And so that was one change we made. Another one was the Medicare transaction facilitator. It's not in the law. And so companies, the manufacturing companies had come to us, wholesalers, pharmacies, and asked us for two things. One, help with the data exchange on how to know which claims would be negotiated drug claims to reimburse for. And then secondly, how to know how much to pay to reimburse to make sure the pharmacies were made whole. And so we ended up building that system for them. And some 60 to 70,000 pharmacies are going to be enrolled in that system starting on January 1. 10 drugs will be included the first year. There's 9 manufacturers, I think, that'll be part of it. And over time, there'll be more, but that was a pretty big operational build. CMS had never taken on anything like that in the pharmacy space. This will be a first. But that was another decision that we made based on feedback. And we had an open door policy. We had a pretty strategic stakeholder engagement plan to get feedback like that throughout the process. And we prioritized that feedback and made sure that, when people came in, we asked them 3 things. What are your questions? What are your concerns? And what are your recommendations? And encourage people to send us things on paper, but also come and talk to us. We want to hear from them. And so I think it actually made our implementation better across the board. And I learned a lot from that. I think our team learned a lot from that. And I just really appreciate that people were willing to engage with us.
So you mentioned that there, of course, are resource constraints, and likely those are only going to get worse. I'm thinking about the early stage biotechs or the smaller pharma that may not have teams that are used to engaging with CMS and others. What piece of advice would you give to these firms so that they start with the end goal in mind when they're planning access or coding, or really planning drug development, and they may not even know that they need to think about access, coding, that sort of thing? Help give a template for the smaller, less resourced companies.
Yeah. The ombudsman program I mentioned is like the first thing they should do. And I think they can do that as they're going through the FDA process, probably in the early stages of their FDA approval process. And maybe even before that, maybe even going in and talking to them when they're in the very early stages of their clinical trial, maybe even phase 1 or phase 2. And so, you can just Google CMS ombudsman and it'll pop up. It'll be like probably the first link that'll pop up. And that, they can come in and talk to CMS as many times as they need to. And I think the CMS staff are really amazing people. Most of them have been around a very long time. They know what they're doing. They know they're experts in everything that they do, whether it's the pricing, whether it's the coding, the operations, the policy. They're also very good at making sure that if people reach out to them, that it's just not them coming to the call or the meeting. They will make sure that their other colleagues come that might also be involved. So if somebody reaches out to them about coding for a biologic, they'll be like, oh, well, I'm going to maybe bring in, the hospital and ambulatory group under Part B, because there might be some coverage questions, or there might be some payment questions, or they might bring in their Part D prescription drug colleagues, because there might be some questions about Part D coverage and formulary. So they're really good about making sure that, it's not just they're prepared to answer the one question that might come up, but they're really making sure that their colleagues across the board in terms of Medicare are there to answer questions that may come. And they're very responsive. So that would be my first and foremost. Just that ombudsman program is there just for that. And that's its job. That's what it was stood up to do. I think the other thing to think about when it comes to CMS is they also need to, that's the Medicare side of the house. They also need to touch base with Medicaid, because they need to think about the Medicaid drug rebate program and what impact that might have. Because there's the Medicaid drug rebate program agreement, which is a federal agreement. And that's the gateway into all the 56 Medicaid programs that exist across the United States. And it's the states and then the territories. And coming in and talking to that group early, because the Medicaid program is actually more complicated than Medicare. And really understanding how to navigate that program early will be helpful. And then that program attaches them to like the 340B drug pricing program. It attaches them to the VA program. So there's some downstream effects when you sign that rebate agreement with Medicaid. So that would be the things I would kind of highlight for them, is come in and talk to CMS, both on the Medicare and the Medicaid side of the house.
Really good advice. What are some top policy and regulatory trends that you believe are going to shape pharma market access, HEOR, and real world evidence, let's say over the next decade?
So I think we're going to see a couple things. I think that, we're going to continue to see conversations around affordability. I think you see that right now playing out with the current administration, talking about most favored nation, talking about, whether it's these most favored nation agreements that we're seeing voluntarily signed between the administration and companies. We're seeing them talk about demos, both in the Medicare and Medicaid space. I anticipate those will continue. And they'll be part of they'll be part of like, how do we get to lower prices, affordable cost? We're starting to see more and more conversations about direct to consumer sales. It started off with HERS, HIMSS, Roe, all those online. But now we're seeing the Trump administration get into that as well. Mark Cuban's cost plus model. So I anticipate those trends will kind of continue over the next 10 years. We'll see how those play out. I also think that prescription benefit manager reform will also be on the table. I mean, we've been talking about that for several years. States are actually making a lot of plays in that, more than the federal. And I think as more and more states take on that issue, it will put pressure on federal policymakers to figure out what they're doing there. And so I anticipate that could be an area where we could see some federal policy making happen in the next 10 years. The other issue that I think that we could see is, what do we do about pharmacies? I was just at an event this morning and brought up community independent pharmacies. What happens to the kind of the brick and mortar pharmacies over the next 10 years, as they're being pressed more and more. And I think that's part of the kind of the PBM reform piece. And then lastly, with the HTA and real world evidence, I think, as we get to, what does all this look like? What is all this affordability, most favored nation, international reference pricing? There's a question, are we just adopting other countries' HTA? Are we just adopting in their evidence reviews and bringing them here to the US? And as you know, the demographics of European countries, the demographics of South Asian countries or, East Asian countries look very different than our demographics, than our drug market. And so do we need to be thinking about what would an HTA look like here in the US and have that conversation? So that's kind of where I see, things going over the next 10 years is those are kind of the three big trends I see. But I think, prescription drugs is a policy issue that never quite goes away. We're always talking about it.
Mm-hmm. So among those trends, what do you think is the major one that the industry is still underestimating?
Well, I think they definitely underestimated the MFN stuff and the MFN conversation. I think they probably, when they thought negotiation passed in 2022, I think they thought that was bad. I didn't think that they assumed we would be talking about most favored nation and international reference pricing, 3 years later? Mm-hmm. So I think they definitely underestimated that you could go farther than negotiation at a federal level and that they would voluntarily agree to some of it. So I think that's been something that definitely underestimated. I also think that they maybe underestimated that they could get PBM reform done. I think that they thought that would be easier than it has been. It's been a really long uphill. And I think people felt like they got really close to it. It's been on the doorstep at least twice in the last 12 months with Congress and just hasn't been across the finish line. And then I think with the HTA conversation, that one's just getting started. So I don't know what their expectations would be for that one, but that one is just getting started. It's going to be new. So there might not be even an expectation set yet.
as you've noted, affordability is constantly the major point of conversation, and likely will only get worse, particularly as the ACA tax rebates are on the block right now. There's Medicare solvency issues, the drug pricing hearings that pop up frequently. What gives you hope that we can still bend this cost curve and not stifle innovation?
The pharmaceutical industry is actually a really remarkable industry. If you think about the timeline of the pharmaceutical industry and all the changes that have happened going back 50, 60 years, they've constantly said the policy changes are going to stifle innovation. You look back at Hatch-Waxman Act, you look back at Medicaid drug rebate program, all these changes, all these changes that have happened. It's been a constant, you're going to kill innovation. And they've rebounded every time, and amazing things have happened. We've seen probably therapies we never even thought we would have. And so I don't think any of this hurts innovation. I think innovation is driven by not these types of policy changes, but how much we're investing in the National Institutes of Health, which that's a concern right now. I think it's driven by how innovative companies want to be. How are we investing in the researchers and our next generation of researchers and really pushing them to think big and think bold? I think that's where we get innovation. I think the genome mapping that was led by Francis Collins at the NIH when I first came to DC, they were finishing that, and that was a huge endeavor. That's where innovation comes from. So, if we look at where we were with the mRNA vaccines, NIH, so I feel like NIH, when it comes to innovation is really driven about people pursuing and people, really driving themselves into discovery and then taking what has been really good science coming out of places like National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, and running with it. And so I think if we want to do one thing to really drive innovation, making sure NIH stays whole and putting investments into NIH is one way to do that. And then making sure that our research institutes are able to bring the smartest, brightest people together and train after generation of researchers to come up with what we can't even imagine.
Mm-hmm. Who out there, in your opinion, is showing real leadership in addressing this affordability issue and staying true to innovating on that front?
It's been interesting. I feel like, some of the companies, I think a lot of the companies in COVID were really doing a lot of innovation. And, I think COVID was a really good example of some of them that were just driving, you would hear like, oh, you can't do a vaccine in this amount of time. And you saw Merck and J&J and, Sanofi. You saw all these companies coming to the deck and being like, yeah, we can do this. We'll figure it out. And so, I think you saw some things like the molecule libraries being like, we'll take things off the shelf. We're going to run everything we can think of through this and try to figure that out. Paxlovid came to the market. So I think I don't know if that's any one company. I think that we are seeing people do things that we haven't really, they're really thinking about how do we repurpose what we have that maybe didn't work before, but we can figure out it's got to work for something. I think that's been really encouraging to see translational science kind of take a new revival. I think the other thing too is that the CAR T and the cell and gene therapy space is just remarkable. I can't say enough about it. I mean, the baby KJ example this year. It's just, if we can do more of that and go into more of that direction and like change a person's entire life, it would be amazing. I think the one thing, going back to the affordability, is how do we do that on scale? And how do we make it accessible? And how do we make it affordable? That's the challenge. We can't do it one baby at a time. We have to really figure out, like, how do you scale something like that and make sure that we can all afford it and that everybody could have access to it. It's not just somebody that is born at the right hospital at the right time. But that's, that type of science didn't exist like when I was born. Didn't exist 10 years ago. But those are the things that I look at. I'm like, this is just amazing where we've come. And I'm hoping more of that comes, and I anticipate it will.
So let's move to our rapid fire round, shall we?
Yeah.
This will be one word or one short phrase responses. One health policy change you wish could happen tomorrow.
Universal coverage.
Amen. A policy or reform you think is misunderstood but essential.
340B.
If you could have dinner with one historical figure, who would it be and what would you ask?
Uwe Reinhardt. And I would ask, what do we do now?
And I'm sure you'd get a heck of a metaphorical story to help understand that. A book, podcast, or article that's changed your thinking this year?
Trade-offs. It's a podcast.
What's a policy buzzword that you wish that you would happily retire forever?
Subsidies.
What's your go-to metaphor for how health policy really works?
Oh, that's a good one. And my go-to metaphor would be sausage banking.
If you weren't in health policy, what job would you have and why?
I'd be a veterinarian. That's what I wanted to be as a child.
And what's one piece of advice that you would give to a young professional entering the world of health policy today?
Be curious and be open to opportunity.
And when you need perspective, what's your reset ritual?
I go home to Kentucky.
Well, Kristi, I want to thank you for a really illuminating conversation. Your passion, I think your attention to the important collaboration that really drives the sausage making that you're involved in, and the importance of looking at the last mile on the implementation have really come through in your responses. And I want to thank you for your transparency and your willing to sit for today's interview.
Thank you, Patti. I really appreciated the conversation.